stop, right? Like
Yeah,
I made it,
exactly.
did the thing. Okay, we're done here. But you kept going. Okay.
Yeah, and the reason was because
What if you had a way to take all of your past failures and mistakes and transform that into something positive? Hi, my name is Nick Cosentino, and I'm a Principal Software Engineering Manager at Microsoft. In this video, I got to sit down with Alex Lau, who is doing exactly that. Alex has written a book that will be out July 16th, 2024, and that focuses on a lot of his learnings based on his past failures and mistakes. In this interview with Alex, he explained how he's been able to take his past failures and make them transformative for himself going forward. He also shared with me how public speaking was an amazing skill set that he was able to learn, not the way that you might expect, and how that transferred into his software engineering abilities. I think this is another awesome interview, so sit back, enjoy, and let me know in the comments if you want to see more stuff like this. Thanks, and I'll see you next time. Where you started, how you got here, because I think people are always interested in this kind of thing because everyone's journey is truly, it's different and unique.
right, yeah, it's funny you mentioned that it's unique specifically because typically when I describe it to people, I say like, "Oh, I'm from a traditional computer science background where I got like a computer
Sure.
science bachelor's degree," but I don't think that that's like traditional at all anymore, right? As you mentioned, people have just like totally different walks of life that they come from, and whereas I think that that used to be the status quo, I think it's really good that it's changed since then because I've worked with people that have come right out of boot camps and they've been really great developers, and it's amazing to see how quickly they can come up to proficiency. But as for my
Absolutely, yeah.
background specifically, uh, like I said, I got a computer science degree and went to college, and then right out of college, I worked at a large company for about 5 years or so between internships and working there full time. And that was in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And between it being very cold there and wanting to just start a new chapter in my software journey, I really wanted to work at the complete opposite end of the spectrum in terms of companies. So I really wanted to see what working at a startup was like, just how that would flex my skill set differently. And I had, in particular, become really enamored with Ruby on Rails and like watching some videos on YouTube and seeing just how quickly they could get up to speed with certain projects and prototype things really quickly. Between all those different factors, I found that moving to Austin, Texas would be a really good fit for what I was looking for. And so
Okay.
almost 12 years ago now, I moved to Austin. And since then, I've worked at a handful of different companies, a lot of different startups, some medium-sized companies. And it's been a really good journey to just have that diversity in my career as well because I got to wear so many different hats and try so many different things. And in particular, during the last couple of roles that I've been in, I found that I very much align with the mission of the edtech space. So the last two companies I've worked at have been in edtech, and I really like them.
Awesome. Well, and I'm curious because you have this mix of experience. I think a lot of people, and I say a lot, I don't know, I don't have stats or anything to prove it. Anecdotally, I hear a lot of people as they're up and coming in their software journey. It's like, well, it seems like the goal is I must work at big tech. And for me, even like that was never the ultimate goal or anything like that. This is something that's transpired throughout my career. But I hear a lot of people just set on like, well, I must work at Fang, right? And you have startup experience, and I'm curious, like, how did you find the learning or the I don't know, the engagement, like the different aspects of being at a very small company versus something that was significantly larger?
Mm, yeah, it's a good question. One big difference that comes to mind is typically at a bigger company, you can afford a lot more specialization. So if you really
Sure.
want to like dig super deeply into like the nuances of Redis or something and like really optimize that and have that be your role, a big company is a
Hmm.
good place to do that. When you're at a startup, depending on your situation and the company and their funding and how much runway they have, you almost certainly don't have that flexibility because there's the reality of it is that you only have so much time and resources that you can dedicate to a given problem at a given time, which
Right.
is neither better nor worse, right? It's just different, but it forces you to make a little bit more judicious decisions in terms of where you allocate your time and your resources. So engineering wise, you probably can't just go to the absolute pinnacle of optimizing Redis. You're probably more worried about like how do we build the next step in this product that get us to the point where we need to be in terms of like trying to find that product market fit. And I think that there's like certainly more hats that you wear from an engineering perspective.
Mhm.
You're probably having to do a bit more of product management adjacent kind of work, or like we're working really closely with product managers as well as working really closely with QA folks. Whereas at a big company, you might have entire teams or certainly resources that are dedicated to doing those things specifically.
But before we move on, this is just a reminder that I do have courses available on DomeTrain if you want to level up in your C# programming. If you head over to DomeTrain, you can see that I have a course bundle that has my getting started and deep dive courses on C#. Between the two of these, that's 11 hours of programming in the C# language, taking you from absolutely no programming experience to being able to build basic applications. You'll learn everything about variables, loops, a bit of async programming, and object-oriented programming as well. Make sure to check it out. Yeah, that definitely checks out with my experience as well. I actually had a conversation with John Vandeveer of Latterly.io, and he actually has stats on the fact that you were talking about specialization at bigger companies, right? Like big companies can afford to have this specialization, like it's literally part of it. Whereas at the smaller companies, yeah, you kind of need to wear all the hats. That's been my experience as well. I find it very interesting. Like when I think about engineering, I think about like problem solving, but I think about problem solving with constraints. And the constraints part is very interesting to me because, like, I'm not saying that there aren't constraints in big tech or something like that, but you feel there's always constraints, right? But I feel like, from my experience, the constraints are felt a lot more in a startup because it's kind of like, hey, look, if we don't get this right or we don't work within these bounds, like we either can't afford it, like we could basically, this whole project could fail. If this project fails, the company could fail, like we have to pivot. It just feels like there's more constraints. And when you're trying to engineer solutions through that, like the creativity really shines. Again, I'm not saying in big tech there is no creativity or something, but that forced like constraints on problem solving in startups is I always thought that was like very very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. That actually reminds me of a conversation I was having at the CTO of one of the companies I was working at, where we were really small, and I was mentioning to him like, oh, I wish we could do like X, Y, and Z, kind of like refactoring sorts of tasks. And he agreed with me, but he had a quote that I thought was very insightful, which was that our goal in like a startup isn't to solve good problems or like problems that are useful or like implement ideas that are useful, because there's an infinite amount of those useful good ideas. It's to solve like the right problems given where we are as a company, which I thought was kind of mind blowing at the time, and I've like really grown to appreciate that sentiment because yeah, you're right. It's like in a world with infinite resources, sure, yeah, let's go for like trying to solve every problem we can, but that's never the reality of it, right? We're trying to work within the context that we have at a given moment.
Yeah, you mentioned the interactions with product or parallels to product, but that idea of we got to work on the next thing that's going to allow us to take the next step versus just like, and I talk about refactoring code and stuff a lot, and I think my perspective on that comes from being in a startup where I'm like, I wore an EM hat at the same time as a software engineer hat, and I had to sit there and I would look at code I wrote and I'm like, man, we got to refactor this, and I'm like, okay, but like, but what do we actually need to do? Like, customers don't care about that, so like, are we going to be working in this space of code again? Like, or is it currently broken? Like, we have to look at, is it holding us back from making progress and we can't deliver the customer expectations? Or if it's not the case, like, let's just go work on where we need to deliver value to customers. And
Right.
eventually, if it comes up again, we will come back and refactor this. And there were times where code would live like that for years, like 4 years. And then someone would be like, oh man, who the heck wrote this? And I would be like, oh yeah, that was me. Like, and I know it's terrible, but here we are now. Ready? If we're good to refactor it now, let's go.
Right. Yeah, that actually brings up another good point that I meant to mention earlier, which is like when you're at a startup or an early stage company, you're typically getting to work on more greenfield types of applications. So like the trying to make those kinds of architectural decisions and seeing the repercussions of those directly down the road is a lot different skill set than working on an existing like, legacy code base that's been around for 5+ years. And just the experience that you get from that, I think, is a lot different as well. Because, like you say, sometimes, sometimes if not many times, it's like, oh yeah, I actually worked on this, right? And this is now a pain point that I can very much appreciate, even though I didn't fully understand that problem at the time.
Yeah.
But
I did this to myself.
Yeah, exactly. I've also heard of this notion called like the prime directive of coding, which is basically that, like, considering this idea that whoever is working on a given piece of code at a certain time was trying their best with the information that they had, right? It's really easy in hindsight to say like, oh yeah, like, why did we do this way when like the reality is, the domain has these other rules that would have made it so much easier if we had implemented another solution. But you don't always have that information at the time, right? And it's really hard to kind of contextualize and empathize with where somebody was when they made that decision, or like what constraints their team had. Maybe they were like trying to do 10 other things, or like get this demo ready for a pitch for investors, or like something else that had higher priority. And I know it's hard to do, and I've kind of like grown to appreciate it over the years, but I really try not to blame anyone, including myself, when I see code that's like suboptimal or like decisions that were made in the past, because you just don't know what somebody was working with at the time.
Yeah, like that really resonates with me. Where I used to work before Microsoft, I was there for about 8 years, and basically since the beginning of it. So I got to write a lot of the original code that was, people say like, this is terrible. And I had a talk that I used to do that I was pretty proud of, that and I like, especially at that time, like public speaking, like could not, probably today I could do it and be reasonably comfortable, but then no. But I still felt it was so important to have this conversation periodically, because we were growing so rapidly, and having engineers come on and they'd be introduced to the code base and they would be like, literally you'd have this kind of thing coming up all the time where it's like, who the heck wrote this? Like, this is trash and whatever. And part of the talk that I would give basically walked through these different areas of code. Like, so it was a kind of a technical talk, but at the same time I was like, look, if we didn't do this, none of you would be in this room. I had said it a little bit more politely, but we did this, and this allowed us to basically survive and ship. Like, conscious decision did it, or it wasn't, but it let us, or I should still say it's probably conscious. It let us move faster, and as a result, we could get to the next step. And it would be things that, after a couple of years, it would finally be like, okay, it's time to go back, and then we might go touch it. But the point of the conversation was basically to let people know, like, it's exactly what you said. We were making decisions based on what we knew at the time, and to say like, hey, this was the wrong decision to make. It's like, it might not be the most optimal code in hindsight, but literally, like, we are here today, sitting all together in this room, listening to this talk because of the code, because we made these decisions and we got us here.
Yeah, I love that point, and like thinking about it that way, and kind of like recognizing like the legacy that got you to the point where you are today, right?
Yeah.
I
realized when I said that I didn't want it to sound like I was being a total butthead, but the way that I presented it, I feel, was less like you owe us something and more like, it's not that you owe us something, but it's more like we should. I think it's totally great to question why, right? If you're genuinely curious about asking why, that's awesome. But if you're like saying why because you're basically trying to indicate that someone's dumb, like, that's where I'm like, that's not okay, because you don't have the full context.
yeah, that underlying intent is certainly important, I would say.
Right.
I kind of wonder if it's like there's something behind the nature of just having code that stands out, because like in hindsight it is suboptimal, or like doesn't fit the problem as well anymore. Whereas like, do people really, it's almost harder to appreciate adequate or even good code, right? Like it's much less likely that somebody is going to be like, oh, what a what a great abstraction we use here. What a great pattern. Because I almost wonder if it's because like when stuff works well, you almost don't notice it, right? Like when an
Yeah.
abstraction is really clear, it's just like easy to read and you don't think twice about it. It's only when stuff is harder to read that you're like, oh yeah, let me like kind of wrestle with this more, bring it up more.
Yeah, it's a really good point. There's probably some psychological explanation for that kind of thing, but being able to, I'm trying to. There's another parallel I wanted to draw here, but you're totally. I feel like you're totally right in saying, like, we notice when things are bad, and good things we wouldn't notice unless, like, they basically go silently. For a good abstraction, you might be in a situation in the future, and this is actually a pretty rare thing, even though we do a lot of abstractions, but like, hey, we're going to switch out the database completely and go to something else. And it's like, oh, thank goodness someone put this level of abstraction there. It's like, and now it's saving us. Like,
Right.
I feel like it's a more rare thing to happen. But the parallel I wanted to make here is even like the different types of teams that you can be working on. This has come up before in the teams that I've been on where like a platform team, sometimes it feels like a very thankless job because you're
Right.
doing all this awesome work and basically people, it's like the expectation is just like these things work and they do well, and you only hear when people are upset. Like,
Right. It's an interesting paradigm, right? And I'm glad you brought that up because there was another similar one I was thinking of in like a security realm, right, where you can do 100 different things and prevent 100 different attack vectors, but if just one of them gets through when somebody's trying to do like a pen test or it's just being malicious, like that, it's just a really lopsided paradigm where it's like so many things have to go right, but only one thing has to go wrong.
yeah, totally. Yeah, and it's funny. I mentioned the platform thing. I was thinking about the deployment team I was just on before, and the security part that you're talking about now is literally like one of the teams I'm on right now. So
Yeah,
that's a very relevant example for me. But yeah, it's challenging, right? Because, and as software engineers, and I'll bring in my EM kind of perspective here, I
yeah,
need to make sure that people understand the value of what they're doing, especially in situations like that where it's like we do all of this work and like it feels thankless, right? And we're only hearing from leadership or other teams when things go wrong. And it's like, I need to make sure that we try to balance that so that people are motivated and engaged to do all of the things that are valuable that allow us to hear the bad things less frequently.
sure. Yeah, that's one thing that I try to be conscious of on the teams that I work on is finding that right balance of celebrating others
Right.
because you don't want to be doing it like every single day and saying like, oh, so and so wrote such great code and like I'm really glad that they did this, even though you might actually think that. But I think that there's like a balance to be struck for kind of like more publicly acknowledging when something works really well. Like maybe your team has just done like a big refactor, it's gone really smoothly. Like I think that that's like a good opportunity to kind of thank the people in the room that have made that happen because
Yeah.
like we've been talking about, there's a lot that goes on kind of behind the scenes if we don't get to like peer behind the curtain and see what's going on. So like having a project that you can tie it to is like a really good way to kind of celebrate that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I was curious though because I know you shared with me that along your journey, one thing that you kind of discovered for yourself was this idea of public speaking being valuable.
Yes.
And I often talk about sort of just a general set of this, whether it's not necessarily just public speaking, right? But this idea that in software engineering, soft skills and things like communication are so valuable. And it seems like you've had a very good discovery for yourself and a lot of learnings. And I wanted to kind of ask you about, your journey with public speaking, how all that's kind of helped shape who you are.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds great. I would almost argue that public speaking has been one of, if not the most important skills that I've fostered throughout my software career. I mean, obviously there is the technical side of writing code itself, but in order to complement all of that, I think that it's been a really impactful journey to get into public speaking. The way I got into it was very unexpected, actually.
Okay.
I had a friend call me up around the holidays back in, gosh, 2015 or so. And we were just chatting and catching up. And I knew he was engaged and about to get married over the next year. And I thought he was going to ask me to be one of the groomsmen in his wedding, so I was really excited about that. And instead, he asked me if I would officiate his wedding, which was a
Oh,
much different ask. And when he asked me that, I had like this flashback of like all of the different times that I've done public speaking, and it's gone really terribly because there had been so many times, whether it was in class or even for a job. One time, I remember that I was invited to go speak at a college campus, and I just did like this abysmal job where I was like
oh,
tripping over my words and stuttering a bunch. And so when he asked me, I literally couldn't even answer him on that phone call. I was like, maybe let me call you back in a few days and think about this.
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so I took a few days to think about it, and the thing that I realized was that it was an honor to be involved in one of the most important days in my friend's life, and I shouldn't let this fear overcome like the benefit of that. And I like wanted to be part of it, and I wanted to, again, I was honored to be involved in it. And so
Right.
I'd heard of Toastmasters before. I'm curious if you've had any experience with it or if you've heard of it.
Not personally to use it, but I have heard of people using it and having like awesome success. And when I say success, the way that I'm gauging success here is that they feel very confident after in public speaking. I'm not I'm not the person like to sit back and like grade someone's public speaking ability, so I'm not saying success based on my observation, but success based on how comfortable they feel after going through it. From the people I've talked to, they were like, "Yep, like that was the thing that did it for me."
Right. Yeah, that's certainly been my experience. And so I had heard of Toastmasters, and I basically just knew it was like public speaking club, which sounded
Mm.
absolutely terrifying to me. But again, it was in service of getting prepared for officiating this wedding. And I knew if I didn't go to this, no matter how painful it was going to be to go to it, I knew that the alternative of not doing it was going to be even more painful and even more scary. So I
Right.
started going to a Toastmasters club here in Austin, and I just really committed to making it. They met every week, so I would commit to going every single week. And then they have all kinds of different roles that you can do, like different capacities in which you can help out with the meeting. Some of them are really small roles where you're just kind of giving a quick intro, like talking for 30 seconds at the beginning of the meeting or something like that. And then they have more involved roles as well, where you can have a prepared speech ahead of time, where you're
Mm.
getting ready and kind of working on crafting your message and then getting up and presenting it to the whole club. And my club was one of the bigger ones. It was about 40 people, which I think was one of the biggest ones in Austin. So it was really good practice to kind of just build that skill set. And it
Right.
kept going week after week. It was really difficult in the beginning. And like, again, it was kind of like pulling teeth, but the thing that motivated me was just keeping this ultimate goal in the back of my mind. And by the time I started going for a couple months and giving those first few speeches, it was kind of like what you were describing, where it became this really transformational
Mm.
experience I was going through, because I just noticed that as I went more frequently, my skill set was getting consistently better and better, and I was growing to be more comfortable being in front of people. And so eventually, my friend's wedding came, and it went really great. One of the most like memorable parts of it was the father of the bride coming up to me afterwards, just showering me with praise, which I really appreciated. He was saying like, I I appreciate how you had like a good balance of humor and you incorporated the story how they met, and so that just meant a ton to me. And again, it was like such an honor to be part of my friend's big day. But the thing that I didn't expect was that I would keep going after the wedding. I thought I would just go
Ah,
and then kind of be
interesting.
done. But
Yeah,
I
like I did it and then you stop, right? Like I
yeah,
made it,
exactly.
did the thing, okay, we're done here, but you kept going. Okay.
Yeah, and the reason was because I felt like it was just a good community to be involved in. Like it was nice to be in this community that was there just for people to get better at, and had like
Mm.
it fostered a lot of improvement and encouragement between all of its members. But also because I felt like at work I could notice a huge difference in terms of how just I was able to communicate and better work with others on my team. And during that time, I actually went from being like a senior developer, like a team lead, and then had a very brief stint as an engineering manager that only ended because I ended up going to a different company shortly thereafter. But it was kind of incredible to see, like within this year and a half time frame, like how much just growth had happened for me personally.
Right.
And so, like you were talking about before, I think that it's easy to just kind of think of our roles as software developers as you sit there and you write code and you kind of work in isolation. But anybody who's been doing it long enough knows that the opposite is true. You're like ultimately having to work a lot with others, craft solutions together, advocate for certain trade-offs, or like better understand what somebody is trying to convey to you. And I think like
Right.
public speaking has helped me in every single one of those domains.
That's awesome. I think the like a good takeaway from just this portion, right, is like that. And I want to, sorry, there's a bunch of thoughts going through my mind. I wanted to mention like the fact that you have a very clear example of like how some type of soft skill that's not just like, hey, I got better at JavaScript or C sharp. I know these design patterns, like nothing to do with that stuff, which is not that it's not important. It's just we park that on the side. Here's some soft skills. We're talking about public speaking in particular, and then that directly translating in your ability to do your job better. And the reason that I was pausing and kind of I had this other thought coming into mind, which was earlier you mentioned like this idea of like traditional route for being a software developer. I did,
Yeah.
same thing. And I always say like, I guess this is the traditional way because that's what we've said traditionally. But I've been talking to more and more people that not only are they doing like say a boot camp route, but they might be switching careers, what they would call later in life, right? They're like, hey, look, when I was 6, I didn't know I wanted to be a software engineer. So, I decided later, and later is very subjective. Some people, it's like, hey, it was in my mid 20s, some people 30s, 40s. But where I'm going with all this, because I know it sounds like a bit of a tangent, is that all of those skills that people were acquiring that had nothing to do with writing code, there are so many other skills that you can bring into software engineering. So people might have been great at doing public speaking, or they might have been great at working with customers because they were doing sales. You have all of these things that aren't just writing code, and you can bring those into your software development and excel tremendously because communication ends up being such a big part of it when you're working in teams.
Absolutely. Like, I think that that's so true in so many ways. And like, almost in the same way that I'm skeptical of companies that only want to hire roles for a given like experience in a given language, although there is a time and a place for that depending on
Sure.
what the position needs. But like in general, if a company just has like a policy of like we only hire people that know Elixir, whatever language, right? And like they have like a hard and fast rule about that. Um, like I'm kind of skeptical if they're looking for the right things, right? Like languages can be taught, especially if you know other languages. It's like very easy to get up to speed quickly a lot of the time. And I think that in general, there's like this parallel of like we tend to over exaggerate the pure writing code side of the skill set and under exaggerate all the rest of the role that comes, or all the rest of the qualities that come along with the role of being a software developer.
Absolutely. And like you were saying with the language and like other skills, right? Like your ability and willingness to learn other things is like in and of itself a skill, right?
Right.
I've been at Microsoft almost 4 years now, and I think I can say this, that it's statistically accurate. Every single person that's been hired under me, and not on the team already, but every new person that's come on board has not known C sharp. And that's what we use. So
Yeah.
that means that every single person at Microsoft, where C sharp is the language we use, right? They came on board and they were like, yeah, I don't know this language. And they're at Microsoft. That's what we're like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
trying to
No,
give you this. I don't know how it could be any more obvious to say like the language itself. Like, it's if someone knew C sharp, yeah, that's great. But it's not going to be the thing that holds you back. If you know Java, you basically just put the curly braces on the next line and capitalize some other letters. You're done. But if you know a lot of these concepts are so transferable that if you have other experiences, like, yeah, I will spend, the first couple weeks might feel like I don't know, like your fingers are numb because you don't know the right things to press on your keyboard. And then basically right after that, you're like, oh, yeah, it's the same as everything else. Like, it's fine, right? So, yeah, I think these other skills, your willingness to learn, I think that programming language example's a great one. When it came, this is a really interesting thing. And one of the notes that you had sent me about public speaking, though, is because it sounds backwards when I go to say this, your ability to public speak better, or a better ability to public speak, has allowed you to be a better listener. So can you kind of explain like your observation and how that's happened? Because listening is incredibly important if you're just sitting there. And I already noticed in this conversation, there was one point where I went to go speak, and I basically in my mind I was like, just wait for your time to speak. And I had to tell myself, no, like you need to shut up and listen. Like, so what's that been like for you with your public speaking and your listening ability?
Yeah, I think part of it is just the way that Toastmasters in particular is organized and the way that they run their meetings. I mentioned before that one of the sections of the meeting is to give like a prepared speech where you're talking for like 5 to 10 minutes on something. But later on in that meeting, there's actually a portion for evaluations. So if I'm giving a speech that's like one of the prepared speeches and you're my evaluator in the meeting, you would be taking notes during that time and then gathering those notes, preparing them, kind of synthesizing it over the course of, I don't know, 20 to 30 minutes. And then at the end of the meeting, you get up and you give me an evaluation. So you're going through and talking about the things that went well and areas for improvement. And I think seeing that and hearing that and just seeing it over and over again across a lot of different speeches kind of just started to make me become very introspective about the way that I not only presented the points that I was trying to make in other speeches in the future, but really just hearing what somebody was trying to say or ways that they could improve saying that. And I think the overall, like, the overarching lesson that I got from that was being able to, during a Toastmasters meeting, it's hard because you're like having two different one-way conversations. Somebody is
Sure.
just presenting, and then the evaluator is also just presenting after that. But when it's in a work environment, for example, you can have a lot of follow-up questions. And so rather than having like this one-way dialogue that the evaluator would have in a Toastmasters meeting, you can have this real-time feedback where you're trying to like dig in and find like this underlying message for what somebody is saying at work, or like helping to clarify the point that they're trying to make.
Interesting. That's really cool. I think yeah, I've noticed maybe a pattern, if I can call it that, that especially as more software engineers become more senior, one thing is that, we lean on a lot of our experiences. It's easy for us to say, hey, I've seen it this way. And
Yeah,
we can sometimes get in our own heads about it. Like, hey, like, just trust me. Like, I know I've seen this, just like we're going this way. We're taking this design path, and it's dangerous, right? Like you want to be able to lean on your experiences, but I think that there's going like thinking about listening here when you have other people talking to you about things, like instead of just waiting to go interrupt them as a software engineer to be like, no, like I've seen this before, we're definitely using this technology or this
right.
design pattern here, like just giving someone the floor and just being like, you can have your own opinions and experiences, great, but just like shut up and listen, interpret what they're saying, like try to understand, because if you don't, you will miss other details. And
Right.
sometimes those details, yeah, you might have done it before, but now that someone's telling you this again, you're like, we did it before. That was 3 years ago. Actually, maybe this has changed a little bit. Maybe this is the time for it.
Right.
But if the whole time you were like, no, 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 like just be quiet, like I'm here to speak, you're gonna miss all that stuff. So listening is critical. It sounds funny, I guess, because it almost seems like it's a passive thing, right? You just sit there and you listen. How hard could it be? But like, it's a
Sure.
skill.
Yeah. One thing that I've tried to do in more recent years is if I'm like submitting a PR for code review or working on some kind of bigger feature, is I really try to align the breadth of that feature with like how much feedback I like purposely go and seek out from teammates. So what I mean by that is like if I'm working on something where it's like a very, very isolated change, where I'm just like adding one new field to a report or something like that, like that doesn't signal any like alarm bells in my head. But if I'm like working on, you know, a new API schema or some kind of like overarching like architectural change for something, I purposely go and try to get multiple opinions on something because I want the solution that we come up with to be well-rounded and like well thought out. And I think that just like acknowledging that you're not going to have all of that context and seeking that out from other developers is a great service you can do to your team and like to help kind of future-proof and get ahead of a lot of the pitfalls that you would see otherwise.
Yeah, I love that. And like one of the best things that happens during that is you're talking to people, you're listening to what they have to say. And if someone gives you some perspective that you hadn't thought of, like you're like, oh man, like you basically feel so thankful that you went around and you were taking the time to listen
Yeah.
to people. Because otherwise you would have gone ahead and there would have been a, you know, a glaring hole in whatever you were doing that someone was like, that's why we need to go do it this way. That's really cool.
Yeah, there's this like mental shift that I've had from like I used to always try to kind of protect my code in code review and like defend it from feedback, and that I mean certainly wasn't effective like in a lot of things I'd worked on in the past, but like it also just kind of in some ways defeated the purpose of being on a team. Like the shift that I've made in more recent years is to rather than thinking about like, oh, this is a solution that I'm creating and I'm proposing to the team, like instead I think about it as like, well, how we have like other team members with a lot of valuable experience and perspective, like how can we as a team come up with the best solution for this? And if I'm the one writing the code, great, but if I'm not, that's great too. Or like if I'm helping implement other ideas that people have that are going to result in a better solution, like that to me is the goal, not just me being right about everything, because I know I'm certainly not right about everything.
That's such a good learning. So thank you for sharing that. It's it's like, you know, we work in teams with a common goal. Like as soon as you start making it all about yourself, that's like, yeah, it gets kind of dangerous. It's a slippery slope. I wanted to make sure we could start diving into your book because you do have a book. I think this is awesome. You have a book. You want to kind of give us a bit of an overview of what that is? And I know I asked you ahead of time, like, hey, look, I want to see if you have some lessons that you can kind of share with us from your book that would be good takeaways for folks. But you want to start us off by what's the book about? Why'd you write it? And go into it.
Sure. Yeah. It was almost surprising to me that I ended up writing a book. I never really pictured myself as the type of person who would write it because I always put book authors on this pedestal of like, oh, only like the best top tier, like person who's like the best Rubyist would ever be able to write a book about Ruby or anything like that. And I've always had this interest in doing technical writing. And so I had a lot of false starts with different blogs over the years. And a couple of years ago, I was starting to just kind of think about like, oh, if I did a blog series, like what would it be about? And I started gathering a lot of thoughts around that and lessons around that. And eventually I stumbled upon this theme of having different mistakes that I've made in the past and how I could avoid those mistakes. And a lot of those mistakes I realized weren't in the code specifically that I was writing, but rather in the approach I was taking, the mental models that I had for thinking about certain problems, kind of like what we were just talking about in terms of working on a team versus like me presenting the solution. Like once I made that connection, it really changed the way that I approach software. And so my book is all about the soft skills and mental models that have helped me throughout my career. And the way that I present those is all through different mistakes that I've made because I've seen that pain directly. And so I think it's nice to be able to tie the lesson that you learn to a mistake that you've made in the past. And so, yeah, the book, again, and I will have an upcoming blog series as well. It's all focused about mistakes that we as software developers make because I wanted to have a safe space for other software
Hmm.
developers to kind of share the lessons that they learned too, because I think there's this natural inclination for us to want to avoid talking about mistakes because it makes us feel, I don't know if like weak is the right word, but like
Yeah.
it's hard to acknowledge that, right? Like in some ways, why would you go about just talking about your mistakes and like broadcasting that to the world? But at the same time, I think that those are really the lessons that are best seared into our memory because we've learned directly from them.
Yeah, that's so many good things there. The I love the idea of, having a focus around failures, right? And you're totally right. People don't like to talk about it. I think the word weak is a good description of probably how people feel. I would say, especially in like a field where we're all intellectuals as software engineers, right? And
Right.
having a failure makes it feel like you must be suboptimal, right? Like you must not be worthy if you make mistakes. It's like a direct attack on your intelligence. Like, how could you be around your peers ever? But the reality is, like, yeah, like we learn most effectively, and actually I don't have science to back this, but I'm pretty sure it's probably backed by science somewhere. But when we have our failures, like that's how we're truly learning. So I always find it fascinating when people will reach out to me, and I'm sure you get this. I'm sure lots of people who have been in industry for a while get this, where it's like, can you just tell me like what the best X is to use here, or like what's the most efficient way to do this? And it's like, first of all, there's context to all these things that people are missing, but what they're trying to do, and I don't blame them, is they're trying to shortcut all of the painful things, like all of the
Right.
failures. Like, hey,
Yes.
you're 10, 20 years into this. Let me just jump to there. And it's like, look, I wish it worked that way. And it literally doesn't. You have to go mess up a bunch.
Yes, that's such an incredibly important point to learn, and one that I do cover in the book as well. I talk about how it's it's really easy to have this mindset that I was describing before of like when you're submitting code for code review, you're wanting to protect it, you're wanting it to just be perfect the first time around, and it's just not the way that it works. Like in some ways, code is subjective, and in other ways, there's just like again with this theme of like if you had infinite resources you could kind of optimize everything, but you don't. So like you can always make code more performant, or have like a super secure version of what you're writing that's like really robust and like fault tolerant and all these things, but like is that the right thing that you need at the moment? Probably not.
Right.
And just getting comfortable with the idea of getting kind of those reps in, having a lot of repetition in terms of like getting code out there and getting feedback and trying to do that, I think is so much more valuable than if you take like a longer period of time to attempt to make everything perfect. Like in either case, you're still going to end up with feedback on your code review, right? So like, why not go for the much faster route where you've still given it a good effort and you can get that
Right.
feedback a lot quicker and have that feedback loop really pay like dividends going forward because you're just doing it so much more and like building that skill set so much quicker.
Yeah, the feedback part is tremendous, right? And I think, again, I'm checking out notes here, but I think, is this, you
Yeah.
refer to this as like the fear of failure pitfall, right? Like basically, if
Yes.
you sit there and just avoid failing, like this is actually not the spot to be in. Like, uh, but actually, I guess maybe this is worth asking too, based on your experience. Um, I think being able to like, if we're failing at things, we're able to learn and have these takeaways. But
Yeah.
can you think about the environments you've worked in, and like were they safe places to fail, and what did that look like, right? Like what did it look like if you were in an environment where you're like, I actually don't think I can take any risks here. I feel like if I mess up, I could be fired or something, versus jobs you were at where you were like, obviously no one's encouraging you like go mess this up, but you feel like, hey, if this isn't perfect, like I'm supported.
Yeah. I think to even take a step back, like I think that there's acknowledgement that's worth making in terms of like the domain itself and the things
Mhm.
that you're working on, where you can afford um, more or less leniency in terms of having things perfect that first time around. Like if you're
Sure.
writing code that's going to be, used in launching a rocket, like that warrants a very different level of caution than it does for
Right.
like most web applications that people are working on, right? And I think that we get really caught up in thinking that things are the former, even when they're actually the latter. Like we tend to, like one thing that I've noticed that I personally have done on teams before is really conflate like the sprint deadline with like an actual deadline, where it's like we really want to get this thing done and we need to get done by the end of the sprint. But is that actually the case, or is it just something that we decided in like an estimation meeting ahead of time, right? And so I think we're talking about like signals for when it's harder to fail or it's harder to overcome that failure is when you kind of just have those guide rails incorrect in the first place, or you don't even have that alignment of like what a true failure is. Like the way that I think about failure is like, again, if it's really just only one chance that you have at something, where it's like you're trying to get a demo ready for investors and there's like literally just one chance for it. Yes, that's the time that warrants like extra caution and attention that you pay to things. But that's such a rare case, and like 99.9% of my job is the opposite, where it's like things aren't going to be dire if we don't get this perfect the first time around, but it's much more important to have like iteration and measuring the results and having like, if you're making like a big architectural decision, taking time to invest in that, because the ramifications of getting that wrong are going to be a lot different down the road than if it's just like this one-off page that only one internal employee sees, right? Like trying to align the attention and time that you put into something with the actual like problem at hand and the severity of that, I think is really important when we talk about like what failure is, because if there's a bug on this page that only one person internally sees, like who cares? Like we can patch it up, we can fix that. Like we shouldn't get too bent out of shape and like treat those things the same as like when something truly is dire.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I think, depending on the scale of your application or system, it's easy to say when it's small, like when you have one thing, you're like, well, it seems like it's a big issue. But the more that these things grow, I mean, even the line with if something's a bug or not, like that it might be like it's just someone has a different opinion on usability and stuff, right? Like
Yeah.
it just gets a little bit more complicated. And if the entire time you're kind of like, in your environment that you're in is such that it feels like everything must be perfect all of the time, it's like I was coaching someone who's doing a bit of software consulting and was trying to basically let them know, like, one thing about the plan that you're putting in place, like, I think it's a good plan. The only thing I can tell you with 100% confidence is that all of these steps are not going to be what you think, right? Like, it's going to be wrong. And instead of saying, like, oh, I tried doing this and like I'm not getting this step perfect, I'm like, don't worry. That's not your goal, is not to get your plan perfect, because I'm telling you already it's wrong. And I'm not saying it's a bad plan. I just mean it's not going to be 100% right. It's impossible. Right. So just accept that you're going to have to make these changes. And if you think about things that way, then it's not like you're constantly failing because you're not hitting 100% of exactly what you planned. You're just using it as feedback to say, okay, how do we get closer to the goalpost next time, and just keep doing it.
Right. Yeah. I think that there's like an interesting parallel between like trying to be perfect in everything and having like this high sense of importance that you associate with like every single task, and having like a high sense of priority and urgency that you assign to every task as being like, well, by doing it this way and by being too absolutist, you actually like lose the focus of like where priority actually lies. Like if you treat everything as like a T0 critical must be done issue, then really nothing has priority, right? And I think that it's kind of the same thing in terms of like how much time and attention you give to different solutions in software.
Yep. And that reminds me, like, I mean, earlier in the conversation, right, this idea of like sometimes being at startups exposes you to some of these things around what priorities actually look like when it comes to getting value to customers. And, for some people, I would say that's why like startups can feel very frustrating for some individuals, where it's like, look, I've not done the code because it's not perfect yet, or like we need to go back and do this tech debt because I don't like the way this code looks. And it's like, look, we just it's just not how it is. Like, we need to
Right.
keep moving, right? So yeah, that chasing perfection thing's kind of dangerous. There was another pitfall you mentioned, and I don't think that I had seen it, I guess, like labeled this way, but I think it's really good. You call it the half measure pitfall, and then talk about basically like having plans for integration and transitioning between systems and stuff. Can you
Right.
walk us through what that is, why it's so important, and kind of how, like, I don't know if there was an example of failure where you were like, this is why this is so
Oh,
important.
oh, there absolutely is. Yeah.
Excellent.
This is one of
Okay.
my favorite chapters in the book, actually. The example that I think of when I think of this pitfall is I was working at a company and we were rewriting our entire front end of our stack in React. And it was a Ruby on Rails application prior to that. And so what we did was for all of like the core functionality, we just wrote that purely in React. And then we had like a handful of lingering pages that were only used by admins of our system. So like out of our full user base, if it was like a couple thousand people at each of our clients, like only one or two were the admins. So like that of course had a little bit lower priority. And what I was in charge of was architecting the transition phase to get us to React on the front end. And what I did for those admin pages was I just tried to find the fastest solution possible, which was having like some of the page render in the traditional Rails view, and then like we sprinkled a little bit of React on top of that going forward.
Sure. Yeah.
So, like the result was by the time our migration was done, was that we had like 99% of it in React, and then like this 1%, these admin pages that still lived in this like weird hybrid mashup kind of going forward. And I thought it was a great compromise at the time. I was like, we focused on what's important, and now we're able to like still deliver value for our customers. And well,
Okay. Yeah.
that was true to an extent. What I began to see over the next couple months and even years after was our plan was like, oh yeah, we have these admin pages. They're in this weird hybrid state now. We'll eventually get off of those. But that day never came, at least not when I was at that company. And like, who knows if it's still like that today, however many years later. And so we incurred like a context switch every time anybody had to work on those pages because they were like, oh, this isn't just fully React. This is like also using this other technology. So we have to like learn how that works. And there's like the maintenance aspect of that too, and the onboarding aspect. And like there's all these little other things that we don't think about. And the most ridiculous part of this all is that it probably would have taken us like another week just to like convert everything else and like put more resources towards that. And instead instead of taking that full measure solution, we took the half measure of kind of like having one foot on each side of the fence for this. And I guess like my main point with this chapter is that this is a pattern I've seen over and over again at different companies where it's like, if you're like trying to introduce a new pattern into a system and the team generally agrees that it's like a good, better way of doing it, like it's not enough just to introduce that and have that live alongside of the old pattern. Like part of the proposal should also be that transition phase, because otherwise you end up in this exact scenario that I'm talking about where you have like all these kind of like lingering little nuisances that live on in the system when in a lot of cases that I personally have seen, like if you just put time and effort to try to convert that over as quickly as possible, you can do that probably quicker than you think, and you can avoid all these other annoyances that you encounter along the way.
I like that. That's it reminds me of something that someone at Microsoft he's been at Microsoft for a while. He's a very, very brilliant person. Someone on my previous team actually introduced me to this phrase, which is not new to anyone, but I don't think I had heard it apply this way, and it's tax. And he would describe different things. I know we talk about tech debt and stuff like that, but when he would call things a tax, it really helped frame things for me. And I'm thinking about your example here, right? So certainly agree that when you have like two patterns or multiple patterns being introduced, and this is pretty common, like you said, you've seen this many times, right? Things don't stay static generally in software engineering, right? You're going to have a code base, and if it manages to survive and live on, there's going to be a point where people are like, look, we've been doing X a certain way, and like, we know there's a better pattern for that now. Let's start adopting it. Or we're using a different tech. Let's start adopting it. And there is usually a transition period. I totally agree that you want to, do that as fast as possible, or have at least plans for what that's going to look like.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring up the tax part because it sounds like, if I'm using this individual's kind of mental model here, in this case, my assumption based on what you described is that it would have seemed like perhaps the tax would be very low to pay in those areas, but perhaps it was not as low as you thought. And I wanted to ask you this, like, if those couple of pages or whatever it happened to be, that 1%, if that was code that truly was going to be touched like once every 5 years, would you feel like this was such a bad thing? Or was it still, it was touched so infrequently and was still that much overhead?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to give every software developer's favorite answer of it depends, right? I think
Yeah.
the thing that I would maybe use as like a way to like uh, like a major factor in that decision is like how painful is it during that time when you have to modify it? Like, is this a sure we're touching it like once every couple of months, but when we do, it's like it takes a developer out of their normal sprint workflow and like they have to like go
Right.
back and relearn all of this code and it takes them like 2 or 3 days to even like build up their mental model to make that decision. That's like kind of an extreme example, right? If the skill set on your team is like everybody is a Rails developer and they also know React and making that context switch is pretty low, maybe you make a judicious decision to not switch that over because
Right.
you're right, it just doesn't like warrant the change. I do think it's possible to go too far in the other direction and try to kind of too eagerly implement the tactic that I'm advocating for in the book of taking full measures. Like I think it's possible to say like, oh, we have this new reporting framework and it's better in these two ways. Let's just convert everything immediately. Like I think that there's
Right.
a balance that you need to strike in terms of fleshing out a new solution and being confident in it. And then once you're at that point of confidence, then fully committing to the transition phase is kind of more the way that I look at that problem.
I like that example because there's sort of an extension of that exact challenge, right? That I've kind of been living through for a couple of years at Microsoft, where there's a technology that we're trying to leverage across a lot of services, and decision was made, and it's I'm not against the decision. I think it's a great piece of technology we're trying to leverage in all these places. But if you imagine the code base, like we're talking hundreds of teams, like hundreds of services, like thousands of people, right? So saying, okay, we're mandating that we're going to be using this technology. One of the things that comes up is that there's actually places where we're not even yet using the basis of what this technology is replacing. So there's like a checklist to go through to make sure that this is all complete, that says 100% of all of the services use it. And it's like, look, people might not realize this, but again, given the scale of things, you're telling us that we have to go into some of these services that might be basically in maintenance. No one's really touching them. They're just working. And now we need to go introduce a technology basically just to check a box, even though it truly won't offer any net new value there, because we're not even using what it was replacing. Like that concept was never even there. So again, to your point, like, would we be in this halfway part? Like, yeah, maybe, but like I was saying, the tax in that case is like, what I've been telling people is maybe the better approach is when we say, hey, we need to go leverage this thing for the first time in this service, let's just introduce it at that point.
Sure.
It's slightly different from your original example because we don't have two things at the same time. We have nothing versus we should go introduce the thing. So maybe that's a slight difference too.
Yeah, I love hearing that perspective. And like, obviously, Microsoft is such a huge company that when you're at that scale versus like a small startup where you have 20 or fewer engineers, like the way that you make those decisions is going to be a lot different. Like the ramifications that you have to think about is also going to be a lot different.
Yeah, the like it's very your answer of it depends earlier, right? Like the context is everything for these types of things. And I think it's so easy to start making arguments about stuff like here's the right way and here's why, and it's like sure, but if you omit parts of the context, it can dramatically change. So I think it's important for people to I think it's great you have these examples to walk through. They can provide you a framework, and what's cool about that is that what you're not doing is saying like simply follow these
Right.
three steps and it will solve every problem. It's like here's
Yeah.
framing for you.
Yeah.
Apply the framing to your situation. If it doesn't fit, adapt it, right? But here's a basis to get started.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the lessons that I'm really hoping that people will come away with after reading the book is that it's important to be thoughtful about software development and not just be really dogmatic about things. And as an author, it's actually kind of tough to strike that right balance because you want to acknowledge both sides of like the topics that you're covering, but you don't want to water down your
Mhm.
like original point. You want to still have a strong stance on that, but not like totally contradict yourself when you're talking about like the pros and cons of it. So I'm hoping that I've struck that balance correctly.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, right? It's like you're trying to offer a perspective, but it can almost be completely watered down if you say, but in this case, but in that case, and
Right.
then 400 pages of a book later, you're like, I think I might have covered everything, right? And someone's like, dude, what were you even trying to say at this point?
Yeah, yeah, and part of it too is how people prefer to receive advice. Like, I actually really like when there's this discussion and nuance behind things, rather than somebody only promoting one thing and only thinking about it one way. Even though there is like merit to have like each approach, and I think it's just different for the reader.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. Well, Alex, I wanted to say thank you so much for making the time to chat with me. I wanted to make sure, I'll follow up with you offline to get links and stuff, but can you let people know where they can find you, where they can check out your book and give us the details? I'll have links and stuff below, but if you want to let us know.
Sure. Yeah, the easiest place to find me is just on the book's website, keepcalmandcodeon.com, based on the title. And that has a section for contact, which has both an email that you can reach me at or LinkedIn. And I'd love to hear from any of the future readers or even people that are just interested in the book or talking about software development, mistakes that they've made in the past. Like, I'm super open to connecting with people.
That's great. And thank you so much for putting this book together and being someone that can lead by example with sharing fails, right? Like here's the lessons learned. I think we would all be in such a better place if we saw more of this kind of stuff and not trying to avoid admitting to failures and like hiding from them. There's just so much to learn. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you appreciate that. And I'm just genuinely hoping that it helps others avoid the same mistakes that I made in my career.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks, Alex. We'll chat soon.
Yeah, sounds good. See you later, Nick.